Good day, my name is Felix Maltsev and I represent Patriarshy Dom Tours company, and today we make a virtual walk into Moscow, Ukraine. First of all, when you hear the very word Kremlin, you immediately imagine these red brick walls, tall towers. So Moscow Kremlin is associated with the very word absolutely. But the irony is that a Kremlin in Moscow is the most untypical Russian fortress. It is the only Kremlin built by foreigners, precisely by Italians, in the end of 15th century, and it was done by the order of Moscow King Ivan III. Much more typical Russian Kremlins we can see in provincial towns around Moscow, like Suzdal, Zvenigorod or Pereyaslav-Zalesky. There will be a soil wall surrounding quite a limited piece of territory with a church, a couple of buildings, quite cozy, quite small. And by the way, one of the possible translations of the word Kremlin into English is a cozy place. But Moscow fortress is a monument of might and glory of Russian kings. Actually, Ivan III was the founder of the United States of Russia because he consolidated different principalities around Moscow. Okay, we are in. We go to the Kremlin by the bridge, and bridges, as you understand, normally are built above rivers. And such a river used to run along the western Kremlin wall. Its name is Niglinka, and now it streams deep underground in a tube. But before war with Napoleon, before 1812, it had been the extra defensive source of Moscow fortress, but it had not saved Moscow from Napoleon, and the river was eliminated. But the bridge is still there. Talking about Napoleon, he indirectly is the first person we meet in the Kremlin when getting in on our left side. Along the wall of Kremlin Arsenal building, we have got the gallery of Napoleonic cannons. Not French only, because his army represented also Italians, Germans, Austrians, and practically all other nations of Europe. All these guns are real, they have been in battles, and we can see the damage they faced during fights. Many of them are marked with traces of splinters, of bullets, and well, it's really exciting because you can feel history there. Across the arsenal, on the other side of the square, we have got the only Soviet architectural intrusion to the Kremlin grounds. The Kremlin State Palace, or how it used to be called in Soviet days, the Palace of Congresses. It was constructed by Nikita Khrushchev for congresses of the Communist Party, which in Soviet time effectively performed the role of the parliament. And it's very interesting to look into the lobby of the Palace of Congresses through the glass facade, and we can see there insignia of 15 Soviet republics, their crests on the wall. Probably that's the only place in Moscow where we can still see these symbols. The first part of the Kremlin represents a more administrative, or if you like, political scent. And on our left side, we have got the classical building of the Senate, constructed by famous Russian architect Matthew Kazakov by the order of Catherine the Great. Senators were not often guests to the Kremlin. They arrived in Moscow only when accompanying the royal family, which, however, mainly stayed in St. Petersburg in the 18th, 19th centuries. But really interesting things began there after Communist Revolution. 1918, Lenin and his comrades moved from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and they started working in that building. Both sessions of the government and of Politburo of the Communist Party used to be conducted inside the Senate building, but also they used to live in it. Moscow Kremlin had been close to everyone but leaders of the Soviet Union and their security guards, till 1953, the year when Stalin died. Stalin was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was a man of company, a man who loved to be in the crowd, and he ordered immediately to open the Kremlin crowds for visitors. And there is a story which is 95% reliable, but who knows? The story tells that Marshal Voroshilov, the former Secretary of Defense, pressed Khrushchev to the wall in one of the corridors of the Senate and started shouting at him, "Why have you let all these asses to the Kremlin? Don't you understand?" And then suddenly Voroshilov burst into tears. "They ask me questions. They suddenly became approachable by the people." That was a nightmare, of course, and Soviet leaders emigrated from the Kremlin to so-called Rublyovka, the western Moscow suburb, where they still, contemporary Russian politicians still live today. And the building of the Senate became just the office. For instance, today it is the office of the Russian president. By the way, we can clearly see the porch under the canopy with the door leading to those apartments, which now is not used anymore. Just at front of the Senate building, we have got the gigantic cannon, Tsar cannon. By the way, word Tsar is the way medieval Russians pronounced Caesar, so that's a royal cannon. When built, it was the largest in the world. It was 1586, and since that time, attacks of Crimean Tatars, steppe nomads, which used to disturb Muscovites for centuries, stopped. Although this gun never used, it never shot, but as chess players said, the threat is more efficient than its implementation. The other huge object casted in Moscow Kremlin is the Tsar bell. Okay, you already know what Tsar does mean. Well, the bell was casted early 1730s by the order of Empress Anna. Perhaps she wanted to demonstrate how mighty a Russian woman could be. But a catastrophe happened. While making the bell, the blacksmith faced a horrible fire, which grabbed the Kremlin 1737. The fire attacked scaffolds from which they were making the bell, and then, for lack of education, they tried to stop the fire with water. Hot metal, cold water. The result is obvious for anyone who learns physics. In the 18th century, they did not learn physics. The metal cracked, and a huge splinter, about 11 tons of bronze, fell apart. So this bell was never able to ring. From the bell, we move to the cathedral square, where so many churches stand next to each other. What for? Okay, there are different versions. And one of them explains that late 15th century Russia under Ivan III was just a confederation of different territories. And in order to demonstrate their unity with Moscow, so each other principality raised some money to construct their own church in Moscow Kremlin. And these cathedrals received consecration for the sake of different religious events, like Assumption, like Annunciation or Archangel Michael, but also these churches served to the royal family for different extremely important events of their life. The Assumption Cathedral was used first of all for coronations, but also for some weddings in the royal family, and most important services on Easter and Christmas were conducted there. Annunciation Cathedral was a domestic royal church where such extremely important thing as confessions had been conducted, and in the Archangel Cathedral till the beginning of the 18th century when Peter the Great constructed St. Petersburg. So before that moment, all Russian czars had been buried in the Archangel Cathedral. From the Annunciation Church, we should turn to right and see that part of Kremlin grounds which had been completely rebuilt after war with Napoleon in the beginning of the 19th century. That territory previously had been occupied by the old Kremlin palace. Now only a few fragments remain after it. One of them was the Palace of Facets we have seen in the Cathedral Square, the palace built in North Italian style by Marco Ruffo, 1491. It had been a throne hall for all generations of czars, but the main part of the palace had been blown up by a retreating French army in 1812, and then by the order of Emperor Alexander I, the new classical building, really big. Okay, we use term Great Kremlin Palace for the new construction, but exact Russian translation sounds as Big Kremlin Palace. 700 rooms. The palace and the next building, the armory, which is a museum of Russian royal family and of Russian culture, they were constructed by the same architect from St. Petersburg, Konstantin Thon, who simultaneously built outside the Kremlin Christ the Savior Cathedral, and that illustrated a very famous political formula of Emperor Nikolai I: autocracy, orthodoxy, national spirit. Autocracy was represented by the palace, orthodoxy by Christ the Savior, and national spirit by the collection in the armory. Now we exit the Kremlin through Borovitsky gates, and when we get out, please look on the right, and then you see on the very basis of the red brick wall a layer of limestone. This is the remain of 14th century stone Kremlin built by Prince Dmitry Donskoy, and then we literally see how 15th century Italian fortress stand on the previous old Russian one. Thus history connects different epochs.